Thank you, sir. Good evening to you. Oh, good. I was about to ask for that dimming of the lights. I'm here to explain to you a little bit about this area that I'm showing you now. This is a map produced by Israel. You can go to a map store and buy a map of the Roman period in Israel. Of course, Israel is a tiny country, and this little piece that I'm showing you is about 30 by 40 miles. That area is called the Galilee. It's simply a Hebrew word which means area. So it's kind of a generic word. The root for that name also appears in the Golan Heights. The G-O-L, Gol, is also from the same root. So it's just a geographical term for area. So there's not much to distinguish it except that historically at least three very important things have occurred. The first, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Maccabean Kings, also called the Hasmonean Kings, came north from Jerusalem and reconquered the area. The populations from the north had moved in after the exile of the Jewish population. And with that move to the north, the Hasmonean Jewish kings asked the locals, do you want to be with us or not? And they said, sure. So that gets reported various ways in the ancient sources. But the Hasmonean kings are up here doing their thing and establishing the history. One of the second major things is that Rome appeared in 62 before the Common Era and established their presence here permanently. They were invited in, by the way, by the Jews who said, we need you to help us settle a dispute we have. You don't care about who's high priest, and we're having a big fight. Would you please help us? And they said, sure. They came in and said, we're staying. And then thirdly, the Romans established a petty kingship here. All of Israel was under one king. His name was Herod. He's remembered as Herod the Great in some texts. He also had three sons, well, three surviving sons. One of them, Herod Antipas, became the tetrarch of this region. His brother Philip became tetrarch across the Sea of Galilee and the river, and their mutual brother Archelaus became ethnarch of half of the country, namely Samaria and Judea to the south, all the way down to the Negev. That otherwise is one of the few things that distinguishes this, because it's not known for its natural resources. There's lots of water. It rains very much here. And our specific site that I'm going to start with, is this one right here, Sepphoris Dio Caesarea. You probably haven't heard of many other sites up here except Nazareth. Everybody asks me where Nazareth is. Nazareth is to the south. It's just, in the 1st century, it's a little tiny village. I'll show you more about that later. Herod the Great also is famous for building this port, Caesarea. You'll notice he names it after Caesar, Augustus Caesar. And then his sons, when they take over, have to establish themselves as builders like their father. Herod Philip and Herod Antipas are more successful at that than Herod Archelaus. But I'm not going to give you all those details. I want to give you some archaeology, and here's what it looks like. The main miscommunication I have to deal with, or misapprehension, people sometimes think we're digging in a desert. And I don't know how many times people have said to me, why do you dig in a desert? And I said, well, I haven't yet. Actually, that's not true. I once dug a few seasons at Qumran. But here we are looking back into Israel from the north, from the lower reaches of Mount Hermon. So you can see that well, there's a lot of grassland today, but there are also forests These are trees. It used to be that Galilee was one huge forest, and it was deforested as late as 1918. Here's the reforested hill of Sepphoris, Sepphoris, as it's also called. There is a major building on the site that everyone from the West, from Europe who comes through here, beginning in the 15th century, mentions this big square building. The upper story underwent some renovations in the 13th century, so sometimes it's called Crusader, but the Crusaders are not in a position to do that in the 13th century. It was the local Arab population that they reworked that. It's a Roman tower. We've dug against it, and now we understand it as a Roman tower. Here it is, a little bit of a close-up, and just right next to it is a Roman theater. This theater was disclosed in 1931, quite by accident. And I always tell my students, and no matter what anyone tells you, all the best discoveries are accidental. Here's our accidental discovery. This is one small photograph of a mosaic floor found in a very large building, which is founded in the year 1 about, it's refounded. It has a history before that when it seems to have been smaller segments of buildings close together. Then when Herod the Great died, the city revolted. The city was completely destroyed. Herod Antipas, the ruler who now inherits, directs that it be rebuilt. This is late in its history, but that big building is in use from the, well, we don't know precisely when, but roughly the year 1, up until the middle of the 4th century of the Common Era. Our mosaic specialist, who was a little irreverent, said this was one fish, two fish. Here are chucker hens, such as you get in this country, and the ones in this country come from the Middle East. Now, if you look at this one carefully, you'll see that his feet are bound. He is being represented as a gift at dinner. You don't carry somebody a jug of wine. You can take them a live bird. Well, it's guaranteed fresh, right? There are 5 by 7. There are 35 of these round or half round medallions in this mosaic floor. So there are lots of things about this city that were a surprise. We started here, I hate to tell you how long ago, 1983 was the first time we actually started excavations. And we started them in an area in which this house had already been dug by Leroy Waterman and published in a preliminary report, but nobody ever checked that. A very famous archaeologist came by the next year and looked at the little small amount that he had excavated and said, it looks like an ordinary house to me. Waterman had identified it as a church. So we've excavated it now, and here's our reconstruction. This is a central courtyard with a tile roof over the columns. The entrance from the outside is about this point. One walks into a long, narrow room with 2 cisterns in the floor, and you come out into the public space. Unroofed courtyards are public space. You have another unroofed courtyard here, but now it's in private space because you have to go through at least 2 thresholds to get there. We can tell this is a Jewish family because everywhere under the floors there are ritual baths, which are characteristic of ancient Judaism. I'll show you some later on. Here's one. There's the there's the staircase going down. There's a cover on it in this later period. Also in the later period when this ritual bath went out of use, somebody was here recycling glass. We thought we did that ourselves. The blowing of glass is invented here in Israel in the course of the first century before the Common Era, and it spreads all over the empire very rapidly. It's quite a technological breakthrough, actually. Here is, I'm sorry, slightly out of focus, but
Dr. Strang,
yeah.
that mosaic floor was in that building?
No, it's in a different building.
Thank you.
But thank you for asking. Now, here's Waterman's Roman theater. Nowhere in the ancient world is this theater mentioned. So no one expected it. He ran into it quite by accident. I have a copy of a glass plate photograph in which one can see in his rounded trenches about 67 workers carrying baskets of soil. And according to his notes, the hierarchy was very advanced and very rigid. The people who had the highest rank were actually digging. The people with the next rank were carrying the soil out. The third rank are the wheelbarrow boys. You dump the soil in the wheelbarrows and then they're carted away. Sifting as such is as yet unknown in sites in Israel in 1931. Then, of course, it wasn't Israel. It was the British Mandate of Palestine. Waterman dug here, sent by the University of Michigan. He dug here for one summer. He then packed up and drove in a Model A northward to Beirut and eventually to Mosul. And there he spent the rest of his career digging and writing histories and so on, teaching at University of Michigan. Well, here's what we think it looks like. The stage is about 90 American feet long, very close to Roman feet. It has a very nice exedra with seating in it. When it was first built, apparently during the reign of Herod Antipas, it had 2 ranges of seats. In the course of the 2nd century, after, we don't say that, we say in the Common Era, the locals built an additional row of seats on it, so it had 3 rows of seats. Now, people often make the same mistake. They don't usually know that there is a big building that blocks off all the scenery. If you're at a play, the Romans want you to enjoy the play and not anything else. So the Scena building, it was almost completely robbed out. That's what that building would be called. The theater itself was almost completely robbed out. That tells us that they were people living here for centuries after the theater went out of use, and they simply used it as a mine for cut building stones. But that's typical of the period. All right, here's a sidewalk scene with some erected columns, which is right next to our site. Our sidewalk right next to our big building was dug up in the 5th century and turned over and made into a mess. So I cheated and took a photograph of their site. But you get the same mosaic. And the mosaic is just geometric, but that's typical of sidewalks. So anywhere you went in the Roman Empire, you have a certain standardization in the building of roads, streets, sidewalks, architecture itself, and that's the easiest thing to deduce culture from, except that it's everywhere in the Roman Empire with very diverse ethnic populations. So how do we deduce whether the people walking the streets are Jews or Gentiles? May I remind you that all the periods that we dig include the emergence of Christianity and the emergence of 2nd century Jewish mysticism, as well as the 3rd century, when we get the beginnings of the literature of rabbinic Judaism. They've been, the rabbis have been on scene for some time. But around 200, the oral law is written down here in Sepphoris. Now nearby is ancient Tiberius. Tiberius is also in the territory of Herod Antipas. I tell my students otherwise he's only known for inventing the antipasto. That's a joke. Thank you. Here is a Roman theater, another Roman theater. Now it's different in that the principal building stone in this area is black basalt. All of this is black basalt. But they use white limestone where they can, which means they have to go several miles west to quarry it and bring it in. But this then becomes a major marker for the city. And here it is reconstructed in this painting. For a long time, we've had these two towers excavated. We've had the foundation of this wall. And by the way, the artist is showing the city is under construction.
Is that the wall that's still on the south side of Tiberius going into?
No, the wall that you're seeing is a Crusader wall.
Okay.
Right up here. Good question, though. The columns, which were to be found in these long stoas or porches, were reused all over the city of Tiberius because this city, founded around 21 of the first century, 21 of the Common Era, becomes a very important Jewish intellectual center, just like our first site of Sepphoris. And the rabbis are here and meeting here right up to the Middle Ages. Even the rabbis are still meeting here long after the area has been conquered by the Arabs in the 7th century of the Common Era. So the Muslim Arabs move in, take over. In fact, this is no longer called Israel or Judea or Palestine. It's called Urdun, which means Jordan. Bet you didn't know that. Aren't you glad you came? Well, we're looking north. So we've got our theater. This is a palace. It's supposed to be the palace of Bernice, which you can check up in your reading and see who that is. But there's nothing there from the first century. So I'm skeptical myself. Now, one of the other things that we've got archaeologically are a series of anchorages and ports on the Sea of Galilee. There are more than 30 of them now that have been located. When the lake is down, as it is right now, for example, then you'll start running across these traces of quays and jetties and anchorages and so on. So we've got quite a bit of information about Tiberius now as well. And what that tells us is that this whole area of the Galilee is under administration of two cities. On the one hand, Tiberius, on the other, Sepphoris. Now Nazareth is another matter. Nazareth is a tiny little burg about 5 miles south of Sepphoris. It's two cities. One at the top of the mountains is in a ring, and it's mostly Jewish. And then the lower city, which is in a big natural bowl, is mostly Arab, Muslim, and Christian. So it's really two cities. But the ancient village was tiny. Here's some very recent archaeology in which the biggest monument in town is the Latin Church of the Annunciation. The way it is in the Middle East, ancient churches are typically tied to an ethnic name. So the Latin Church means these are foreigners, these are Latins. They've come in from Europe. The local churches are Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic, Mennonite, pardon me, not Mennonite. There are some Mennonites, but they don't have a church. Protestant churches from the 19th century forward, but otherwise there are a few Syriac-speaking Christians, overwhelmingly Christians who use Greek in their liturgy, and then the big Latin church. Now, you can have all that for free because the ancient village, well, here's a tiny fragment of it. This is typically the way archaeology gets done in Israel. Someone buys a lot, destroys the house that was on it, starts to dig a foundation, runs into something, and the archaeologist is standing right there. He's been waiting. So that's the end of that. You're not going to build anymore, at least for a while, because this has to go before now a national committee to adjudicate to what extent it has to be preserved, or it might be sacrificed. They might actually allow it to be sacrificed. You can no longer see this. It's now inside the building that's been built here. But what this does for us is give us a very clear, nicely stratified evidence from the second, first centuries BCE, and from the first to the fourth centuries of the Common Era, even in this tiny patch. So it's very well dug by professional Israeli archaeologists. We're not going to find out much about the rest of this building until somebody builds another one next door. Now, one of the reasons I'm even belaboring this is because a surprising number of people email me, sometimes call me, because they've been reading up on the archaeology, they've been reading up on Nazareth. And Nazareth is not mentioned anywhere outside the New Testament until about the 2nd century after Christ, that is. It's a little Jewish town. And when it's mentioned at any length in the 6th century, it's still a tiny little town, and it has a Jewish population still. So it doesn't become a hotbed of Christianity, so to speak. So there are people out there all the time calling me and saying, did it really exist? And I'll say, yeah. And there's others, other places that have been excavated beneath the big church, directly beneath that. And then just 2 blocks away, Les Dames de Nazareth, they have tombs and so forth. There are various places. People have dug on the property of the YMCA and found agricultural installations. So it's a nice little village. It's just not anything of note.
Jigsaw puzzle archaeology.
Something like that. This is the village of Asochus, it's called in Greek, or Shechin, it's called in Hebrew. So you can see it twice. But there are traces of important occupation here. These are the bottom of a column. There are 2, look like donuts stacked on top of each other with a little cavea in between. That is found all over the Roman Empire. Here's a base stone which has a hole drilled in it, presumably for some architectural purpose. So there's quite a village here. Our son is launching a project here. If any of you want to dig, he's still looking for volunteers. About 4 weeks in May and June. Last summer, Carolyn, who's in the audience, my wife and I were there, and others, and a local archaeologist came to visit us, and when he stepped out of his car, he discovered a Roman milestone. There you go. Now, this is not it, I'm sorry. I cheated again. I showed you the one from Kibbutz Hanaton, but it shows you exactly what it would look like. The one that we discovered is on its side with weeds around it. In fact, now it's been trucked into storage at the nearby city of Beth Shan. Now, nearby there's a city of Yodfat, and I would have presumed that you don't know it. There are sites which are very important historically, but which you would never hear about unless you were somehow involved in a project or you were studying ancient history in detail or something. So here is a hill. It's left bare. The Forestry Service was not allowed to plant trees there. because that, messes up the archaeology. Everybody knew that it was an archaeological site, and everyone knew the name because the name Yod-Fat persisted into the modern period in two nearby localities. There is today, right to the left of the photographer, to our left over out of the scene, a modern village, a completely Jewish village of observant Jews. So you see lots of young mamas with their children out there if you drive through the village. The site itself has been excavated by first a combined American-Israeli team and finally by an Israeli team. This is the first site, the first city to receive the brunt of the Roman siege in the first Jewish revolt. So historically, this became an important site then. What can we learn about the type siege that went on? Who were the people, who were the defenders? Did they leave any text behind? That's one of the things we have to deal with. We have a bias toward texts, including ancient inscriptions. Except me, of course, I wouldn't do that. One thing I want to point out about this village, this little town, it can't be seen because it's nested in the circle of mountains. So anywhere outside the circle of mountains, you don't see it. But the Romans figured out where it was, and they brought siege engines up and killed everyone in the city. Let's go to Cana. Cana is right down the same valley. This is the Beit Natofa Valley. It's one of the largest valleys in the Galilee. And it's probably, in our latest economic reconstructions, owned by Herod the Great himself and then by his son, Herod Antipas. This is a very, very rich valley. In this picture, you can see a low, bare hill, and just like the others, nobody's allowed to plant trees on it. The Forest Service in Israel plants trees by the million, literally, trying to reestablish the forests, and also the flora and fauna, by the way. This one has been under excavation. Let me say that there are 7 candidates for Cana of Galilee mentioned in the Gospel of John. I think only 2 of them are viable. I personally think this is the most logical site for Cana of Galilee, but there's another one, and they're digging at it. And this is the one they'll take you to on a bus. If you take a tourist bus and you want to see Cana, they'll take you here. And they'll take you to 2 churches. There's a Greek Orthodox church and a Latin church down the street, both of whom claim to be over the very spot where Jesus turned the water to wine. Well, here's a ritual bath. I told you I'd show you a ritual bath. Here's what a ritual bath looks like. Now, it has a building on it, but the idea is at the beginning of Shabbat, of Sabbath perhaps, which is Friday evening, at the end of Shabbat, depending on how pious you are, you might want to be ritually clean. It's not hygiene. So you immerse yourself in the water, say your prayers, come out, put on a white garment, and now, if all goes well, you will stay ritually clean until Shabbat is over. It's part of every ancient religion that we know has some form of ritual cleanliness. So this is the one from the other Cana, but that's okay. You get to see what a ritual bath looks like. Magdala is another place. If you drive to Israel today, you'll drive up this main road to go north all the way to Lebanon. Well, you can't get in Lebanon from there, but but you get the idea. There is one excavation here of a port or an anchorage. There is a piece of land here which has been excavated in the past, and the ancient city of Magdala, otherwise only remembered because Mary Magdalene of the New Testament is from there. The word Magdala, Migdal, and variations means tower. So there are lots of towns named Tower. But this one is the favored one for that particular village, the one known from the New Testament. Now, years ago, I helped excavate in the Mayoral Excavation Project 4 synagogues and their villages. Well, here's an accidental find. The Roman Catholic Church, the Latins as they say, bought a piece of property here, well, expanded and bought another piece next to it, because they wanted to build a worship center, a facility for pilgrims like a hotel, and so on. In their proposal, the east end was sitting right on top of this spot. The Israelis said, well, you're going to have to do some excavations because you know you're going to run into something. So before you're allowed to build, you're going to have to do that. Well, they found a synagogue. There's a synagogue of the 1st century. We only have 7 synagogues earlier than the 2nd century of the Common Era. There are 54 synagogues that have been otherwise excavated in Israel. You probably don't know this. More than 300 churches have been excavated in Israel. There are far more churches from the time when Palestine was a Christian government, but we have 54 others that have been excavated. Well, this was quite a find. I'm not going to walk you all the way through this, but I want to call your attention to benches along the inside of the walls, a room on this side with benches. These are also places to sit, benches, but there's columns on them. So it's kind of an interesting building. And there's one stone right in the middle, which is quite amazing. Now again, it's 1st century of the Common Era. Now the Israeli public, they know perfectly well who Jesus is, but the newspapers don't say, look, you know, Jesus may have walked here. The newspapers would say, look, it's a Jewish synagogue from the 1st century. So one of the things they have to deal with are tourists. Many, many tourists. But this piece of stone is a very hard limestone. They grade in limestone from 1 to 9 in hardness. This has hardness of 9. It's very hard. It has interesting motifs. I don't know if you can tell it. This is a jar with 2 handles. In the center, right here, is a menorah, a 7-branch candlestick. No one expected to find that. There it is. They're even helping us to get a date on it. This is hard to tell because it's rotated, but it's an image of a lamp of a typical sort found in the 1st century of the Common Era. So typical that it's called a Herodian lamp, after Herod the Great, and then his sons. Well, this has become quite a find, I must say. But it helps us to understand even the village of Magdala, otherwise not, well, it's known for 2 things. It's known for Mary Magdalene in the New Testament. But in the ancient literature, it's only known for producing smoked fish. That's what it's remembered for. So, you know, if you really like kippered herring, this is the place to go. And here it is turning up this stuff. On the interior of the synagogue, there are painted plaster panels, which we have also found at Sepphoris in our large building. There is a mosaic floor. Mosaic floors we associate with 4th and 5th century synagogues, but this one here is in the 1st century. The difference is the 4th and 5th century synagogues have all kinds of pictures of animals and even people on occasion. But that looseness about the 2nd commandment is not reflected in the late period. In the 1st century, they only allow themselves geometric designs. And by the way, the guy isn't really cleaning it. He's making it wet for the photographer. This is the Anchorage for ancient Magdala. An Israeli named Mendel Nun spent years circumambulating the lake. He lived down on the south edge, looking for all these places. And this one was found, and you see the arrangement where you have built into the wall at the water level, that's the ancient water level, a place to moor your boat. There are places for 6 boats, according to the excavators. Here's the boat that was found nearby. This is a painting and a drawing. And this was invaluable information for archaeologists. If you talk to a boat builder, the boat building tradition is quite rigid about what kind of wood can be used for what part of a boat, depending on what part of the world you're in. But all the boat builders know exactly what wood to use where, but not this guy. He used 24 different kinds of wood. If he needed a piece of wood, he went out and got one. First, he made the hull, and he edge planked it and put mortise and tenons in. And then late in the life of this boat, he put in these what look like, I've just lost the word. What do you call them? Ribs, thank you. They look like ribs, but you'll notice that they don't go the whole width. They don't go gunnel to gunnel. They go just little short distances. And what they're doing is correcting for leaks. But finally, this boat is lost. It looks like it's destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. And here's what it looks like if you reconstruct it. In this case, a friend of mine, Dan Warner, and I got together and raised some money and hired a virtual reality artist to put this together so we can see what they look like. This is the steering oar. It's got a simple square rig. There are 2 steering oars. The local Israelis are always good for a laugh. They say, it only held 12, so somebody had to walk. Now, we cheated in this illustration. What we're showing you is men with diapers on. But if you fish with a net in the ancient world, you fish at night, and you take your clothes off. You don't want to mess your clothes up. You only got one garment. And about once a year, you buy a new garment. So you roll it up and you stash it somewhere, and everybody fishes naked. And we've got a reflection of this in the Gospel of John. In one of the resurrection scenes where the disciples see Jesus, John says, "It is the Lord." Peter puts on his clothes and leaps into the water and swims to shore. So the gospel has it right. You fish naked. Here's how we got a date on it. This lamp and this casserole, it's sometimes called, are definitely 1st century forms, and we know these very well. And we know that they change after the Great Revolt, so this has to date before that change, therefore around 70, the date of the Great Revolt. The nails, we can't explain because they're not going to nail them into the boat. A reasonable expectation is simply that the guy was delivering these things the last time he was in the boat, but it sank on him, and so he didn't try to recover them. Well, nails are just nails, you know. All right, Capernaum. Capernaum has been under excavation since 1928 by various people. The western half of the ancient site is purchased by the Roman Catholics, and the eastern by the Greek Orthodox. There's a wall between them. This is the synagogue, very well known, and it's partially reconstructed. If we took this same photograph in 1928, you would just see a jumbled mess. An excavator named Orfali dug, and nobody knew how to reconstruct this building, but he finally doped out what it looked like and how we're supposed to understand it. Now, 2 blocks away, this modern construction is there. It's a church, but it's not a church with a congregation. It's a memorial church. So if you're Roman Catholic and you're traveling and you've got a priest, he can ask to read Mass here. But otherwise, I've only seen it open once for people just to walk in and walk out. And in the center of this structure is a glass floor, and you can look right down into one room of the house that's underneath. And that house we reconstructed it here, and this is the room. It's a black basalt house that has an entrance into an unroofed courtyard. It also has an entrance into a shop, so they may be selling fish. Beneath the floors, in this part, they found 2 fish hooks of the early centuries. The excavators are all PhDs, but they also happen to be Franciscan priests or brothers. So they identified it as the church of the house of Peter. We don't know that. In archaeology, you very seldom find out. You know, think of the discussions. Have we got Ben Franklin's house or do we not? When they were digging up there in Philadelphia. Have we got George Washington's barn? You know, what have we got? Well, we can't be for sure. But the smoking pistol is close to this one. At least Christians in the 3rd and 4th centuries were coming here, and they were writing their names on the walls, and sometimes prayers, and they would say, Lord Jesus Christ, save your servant, and then you'd write your name. Or sometimes, remember your servant. It's the most common prayer in the Middle East found in graffiti. So we've got Christians honoring it as the house that Peter owned and Jesus lived in. We just don't know. I'll rotate it around so you can see the other side. We've used all the archaeological evidence we can get. You'll notice that men wear white or off-white, and the women get to wear color. Now, the artist has chosen to have the women pull up the scarves they've got and put them on their heads. That may have been true for some of them, but surely not for all of them. The tree is actually, both these trees are lemon trees, because the rabbis take it as an iconic statement to say every man should be at peace, sitting in his courtyard under his lemon tree. And here's what the synagogue looks like from the 1st century. The one that I showed you at the beginning is a 4th or even 5th century synagogue, 4th, 5th century of the Common Era. It's not the one Jesus preached in or anything like that. But underneath it is a 1st century building, which if we bring it up, it is preserved to this point. So if we multiply those lines up and do what we have to do to get a roof on it, which includes clues from these other 1st century buildings, we can get a reasonable reconstruction of what one looks like. By the way, the program that you use to do this kind of visual reality allows you to calculate how much light is coming in the windows at a specific date and a specific time. So we picked 9 o'clock in the morning on a Shabbat. In April, it was too dark. You didn't get near enough light. So finally what we did, we actually, I can't show you now, but if we were to blow up this wall, you'd see that it's plastered. As a matter of fact, the excavators found pieces of plaster. Here is our reading point, and there is no permanent place to read from in the 1st century, as far as we know. So we just made a table. And here's our congregation. The hangings are to help control the coolness if they're starting early in the morning. The lamp that's on the table is actually a first century style lamp. And if you look at all these guys carefully, they're all clones. It's because it costs a lot to make everybody unique. So just reproduce them. Here's just a fun thing to show you. You know, ladies, how you always lose just one earring? We ordinarily find one earring. Here's a typical Roman gold earring with what looks like semi-precious stones are just pieces of glass, Roman glass. And then these are actual freshwater pearls. And here's a little place to grind powder, perhaps for makeup, because they have blue, green, and red, as well as black eye makeup. Here's another stone vessel. And these stone vessels also help us to understand that these are Jewish citizens. One of the historical questions has been, okay, to what extent was Galilee a Jewish area? The answer seems to be in the first century, it's overwhelmingly Jewish. In the second century, with the destruction of Jerusalem in 135, the second destruction, is when we start getting Gentile populations in the Galilee. And then I just thought I'd show you these because otherwise you're not going to see them. This is a coin of Herod the Great. He's a clever guy. He's certainly the Jewish king, but he likes to use images on his coins which are a little questionable, but just a little, because most people looking at them won't recognize them. But this is a fairly well-known type of incense burner from the pagan cult. This is Herod also, but in this case, he's showing us what the table of the bread of the presence from the temple looks like. Now, I don't know why it has 3 legs. Is that the artist trying to figure out how to show it to us and says, well, I'll just show you 3 legs. This is not a plus sign. That's usually an iconic representation of 2 shields crossed. These coins are tiny, but here's Herod stepping off the bounds. These coins are about the size of your little fingernail. All right, so they're called leptons. And this one has an eagle. Now, his own son, Herod Antipas, on his coins, never put a representation of a human or an animal, but the father, Herod the Great, did. Herod the Great rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, and he ordered that an eagle be hung over the door, and it caused rioting. And young men climbed up there and ripped down the eagle, and then the eagle got saved by the Roman forces, who then summarily killed all those participating in that sit-in. And here's Herod, in effect, on one of his smallest coins saying, nah, nah. That was a real eagle.
What's the material of the coins?
Bronze. And then I'll show you this one kind of for fun. This is hard to see because it's so cruddy. It's Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. This coin is about the size of a quarter. Well, why is it so cruddy? Because it's so full of lead. He actually cut the bronze with lead, as though his subjects couldn't tell. And here are some coins of Pontius Pilate I just threw in for you. Pontius Pilate also liked to depict things on the coins, which the Jews found abhorrent. You'd have to rotate this image to the right, 90 degrees, and it would look like a ladle. That's very well known from pagan rites. And then this one, just to show you what a road looks like today. If you go out looking for a Roman road, you gotta have a sharp eye, because what's left, if anything is left, looks something like this. And here's another edge of a Roman road near where we live in Nazareth. And here's the guy who caused all the trouble. That's Nero. Well, I hope you are enlightened. Do you have any questions? Yes.
I was interested
Bob.
in when you were talking about the construction and the archaeologists being out there and the requirement to excavate. So it sounds like they have a fairly strict
Yes.
rule, but do they? It also sounds like basically there's an archaeologist there monitoring or waiting for that. Do they do
Well,
surveys ahead of time, or I mean, how does that work?
Actually, the archaeologists who are assigned to an area, they just drive around every now and then, see if somebody's getting ready to build. And then they ask, are you getting ready to build? What's your opening date? You know? What's the date of the first time you're going to stick something in the ground? Then he shows up.
And then they can't build until that's clear.
He has the power to stop them utterly. Now, they can immediately appeal to the courts. And the way it works in Israel, if you need to appeal the decision, you can start appealing very quickly on certain archaeological matters, all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court could hear you in 1 month. Imagine doing that here. I saw a hand over here. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if this was in the area you were getting at, but I know on TV in the last several years they've had several documentaries on 2 sites near the Dead Sea. So I may be butchering the names, Baba Dra.
Oh yeah, Baba Dra. You said it just right.
Okay, and I was wondering if you've ever done any work in that area. I mean, they talk about it.
No.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Well, probably Baba Dra's now because it's a big cemetery. There are more than 500,000 graves there, tombs, and they date from about 2200 before the Common Era, right up to about 1800 before. And they were found because literally thousands of pots of that period started showing up in the antiquity shops in Jerusalem. But they are in Jordan. The site is Jordan. Now, right above the cliff, there's a site called Numera, which could be one of the 5 cities of the plain, including Sodom and Gomorrah. Because at the head of each wadi, there is an ancient city of this period, and they were all abandoned after about 2000. BC, yeah. Oh, a wadi depends on your idiolect. What do you call a place that only runs water in the winter? When I was a kid, those places were called branches, but that's in East Texas. People from West Texas said arroyos, or sometimes they just said creek. They said creek even though there was no water. You know. So a wadi is a place that runs water in the winter, but it dries up by the time you get to May, June, or it's mostly dry. You might plant crops in the bottom of it because it's been absorbing water. Well, thank you very much. It was very nice.